Hello and good morning, everyone from New York City. I welcome all of our viewers to this virtual salon. I am Sarah Demy, founder and CEO of Demy-Colton. And on behalf of our partner for this exclusive salon, Biotech Digital Partnering, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 46th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. As usual, we welcome all past participants back and all of you who are joining us for the first time as well. Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change. We do this through our in-person events, including Biotech Showcase, our CEO summits, our virtual salon series, such as this today, as well as our meeting BioFuture, which will take place in New York City at the end of October. I hope you all join us. BioFuture is where change makers and investors come together to shape the future of healthcare. And today's salon will give you a sneak preview of the type of cutting-edge, forward-thinking discussions that will take place at BioFuture. Join us there, October 28th through 30th. Now to today's salon. The topic is the U.S. political landscape. What impact will it have on the biotech industry? And before we start, I would like to introduce Patrick Fry. Patrick is the founder and CEO of Venture Valuation, as well as Biotech Gate Digital Partnering. He's located in Zurich, Switzerland, and a good friend of ours. Patrick.
Yes, welcome everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for this collaboration event we're doing. It's always a pleasure to work with the team at Demy-Colton, and we are also looking forward to BioFuture. Will we be there as well? We use the same partnering system and that we have at Biotech Gate Digital Partnering. So this event today is also part of the 1 week digital partnering. So if you haven't signed up or if you're interested, there's still half a week left to do some partnering with people, over 800 people from around the world. And so I would just invite you to join that as well. With that, I give back to Sarah, and I'm very much looking forward to a very interesting panel. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. Some housekeeping notes before we begin, before I turn the virtual mic over to the moderator. The salon will start with a 50 to 55-minute discussion, and it will be followed by a Q&A session. Note that the salon is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing later in the day today. Now to today's salon. I'd like to invite our panelists to come on screen. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Karen DeShane. Karen is a partner at Wilson Sonsini, and she's got a group of great panelists. Neil Meja, he is the co-founder and CEO of Entity Risk. We have Peter Rubin, he's the executive director of No Patient Left Behind. We have Ivan Sepsis, the managing director of ESC Advisors. And we also have Greg Simon joining us. Greg is the former director of the White House Cancer Moonshot, and a few other things in there. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Karen, and I will return during the Q&A session. So Karen, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to be a part of this. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a partner at Wilson Sonsini. I have a corporate and securities practice that is exclusively life sciences. I represent biotech companies from formation to exit, public and private both, primarily in the development stage, pre-commercial stage companies for the most part. And I'm physically located in San Diego. And now I'll ask my panelists to give a quick introduction about themselves. Yvonne?
Hi, Ivan Sepsis. Thank you for being able to participate in this. It's a real pleasure. I'm with ESC Advisors. It's a boutique investment bank, and I work with life sciences companies doing both M&A and financings. And I think this is a really relevant topic as we move into November and beyond. So thank you.
Neil?
Thanks, Karen. I'm Neil Meja. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Entity Risk. I'm an economist. I started my career in DC the Congressional Budget Office. I spent about 19 years at Pfizer, the last 4 or 5 as chief economist at Pfizer. Spent a lot of time thinking about policy issues. We started Entity Risk about 3 years ago with my partners, Dana Goldman and Darius Lakdawala, and we focus on issues around value assessment, issues around pricing, drug pricing, helping companies to commercialize their drugs in this ever-evolving policy and value assessment environment. So looking forward to talking about this. Oh, and I teach classes in health policy at Columbia when I'm not too busy.
Greg?
Hi, I'm Greg Simon. I'm currently the president of my own consulting firm, Simon Ovation. I've been in biotech since 1985, when I was the staff director of a subcommittee that held most of the early hearings on biotech back in the day. I also worked as chief domestic policy advisor for Al Gore and have been involved in 2 presidential transitions, from George W. Bush Sr. To Clinton, and from Bush to Obama. I was also the senior vice president for patient engagement and global policy at Pfizer for 2.5 years, which is where I met Neil. So I've been on both sides of this industry, and also have started several patient foundations, Faster Cures, Melanoma Research Alliance, and after we did the Cancer Moonshot, we started the Biden Cancer Initiative, which existed from 2017 to 2019.
Thank you. And Peter?
Hi, good morning. My name is Peter Rubin. I'm executive director of No Patient Left Behind, which is a coalition of biotech investors, innovators, and patient advocates that was founded by RA Capital's Peter Kolchinsky. The background is in health policy on the Hill, on the House side and the Senate side, including during passage of the Affordable Care Act. I've also worked for innovators and health plans. And at NPLB, what we're trying to do is advocate 3 guiding principles, which is 1, that if a doctor prescribes a treatment and the insurer authorizes it, it should be affordable to the patient. Secondly, that drug prices should not stay high for too long, so there should be finite brand pricing through genericization or government intervention post-patent to ensure sufficient incentives remain in place for continued biotech innovation. And it's great to be here today.
Thank you. So as everyone can see, we have a great panel to discuss this particular topic regarding the U.S. political landscape and the biotech industry, the potential impacts that the upcoming election may have in particular. And I thought we might start the panel today talking about some bigger themes before we get into maybe some specific legislation that's on the table if we have time. And so on the first big theme, I think at least the 2 presidential candidates, and certainly a number of the candidates for the 2 houses of Congress, have different views on regulation, federal regulation, and federal agencies, both healthcare related and non, including for example the FTC. And so I wanted to open it up to the panel to hear your views on the differing views and how that could impact our industry and the financing environment in our industry.
So Karen, I can...
Oh, go ahead, Yvonne, yeah.
So I think when we think about FTC specifically, it's really about exits as it relates to investor mindset, right? What is our exit? How easy is it to exit? And are there going to be barriers to that? And from that perspective, I think we've seen some of that already. Contingent on which administration is put into office, I think we're going to see more regulation versus less. I mean, that's a big, broad comment, but I think there's kind of the short-term impact, kind of the medium-term impact. And what I mean by that is it takes a little bit of time for legislation to actually be put into practice, even though, as I said, we've seen this already. Do I think for emerging growth and mid-cap life sciences companies, it's going to be an issue? We'll see. We have seen that, which is surprising, right? We're not talking about large cap pharma and large cap pharma. We're actually talking about smaller transactions by larger companies. So I think contingent on who that's going to be, it might impact a little bit. And I think the financing environment, we'll get into more of this in terms of what's really going to impact the financing environment in the short term, medium term, and long term. I kind of put this in the medium term bucket, but others, please chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, if you want to talk about big picture, not exactly health regulation, if you think about tax policy, I think that's a major point of divergence between the potential election outcomes. And certainly I lived through many years of attempted and actual corporate inversions and things of that nature, where some of that like impetus to re-domicile your company and all that, could that come back? Could there be a whole bunch of regulation around that? Sure. I think increases in the marginal sort of corporate tax rate, if you're a startup, I'm not sure how much they matter. If they matter a lot, though, if you're an acquiring company, and there are all the knock-on effects on like how valuable are your net operating losses and things like that, which can have really kind of weird effects on startup economics. So I would just say that's an area where this group is probably not the ultimate expert panel, but I do have an eye on what's going to happen to tax rates, and it's probably one of the most clear areas of distinction between the different outcomes.
So I think, first off, thank you for having me. Secondly, we tend to focus too much on the people at the top. It's the team they bring to the table that really does all the work and that matters. There are a lot of issues we're going to discuss that neither Trump nor Harris would ever hear about. Somebody below them will take care of it. So the other thing is, and with regard to what Yvonne said, exit strategy is not a criteria in the Sherman Antitrust Act. So Silicon Valley gets itself all twisted in a knot because they can't make more money, when one of the biggest problems in our economy right now is not runaway liberal taxation. Taxes are lower than they've been for a long time and far lower than the rest of the world. The problem is the gap between the middle class and the ultra wealthy. And when you are running for president, it is not a good proposition to say you're just going to continue helping the richest people and the richest companies in America when healthcare is the leading cause of bankruptcy. So I think one of the issues pharma and biotech have always had is this solipsistic approach to politics, which is they don't seem to remember they're in a dialogue. And on the other side of the dialogue is the entire American public who can no longer afford life-saving medicines. And thank goodness for the Affordable Care Act, because over 35 million people have insurance that would not have insurance. And if Trump is elected, they will, and the Congress is Republican, they will not have insurance again. So there are some very big issues. What the FTC does to block this merger or that merger is not the biggest issue by a long shot.
Hey, Greg,
I just say, like for my client base, it is an issue, right? So exit that Yvonne talked about, and the ability to exit to facilitate innovation in early stage companies is actually a really big concern.
Yeah, and I would say, just my 2 cents on Greg, just to respond to some of what you said. I mean, I think hopefully, on this panel, it's helpful to just think about what the consequences will be rather than the underlying motivation. So, for example, I completely disagree that tens of millions of people would lose insurance coverage in a Republican world. I'm not a Republican, but it seems completely, off the mark to just assume that would happen. I think that all the impetus, both parties have clearly shown zero interest in reining in any kind of entitlement spending and have explicitly said that they would do the opposite. And I think, the question is more like, under which version of politics will you see more expansion of government benefits rather than will you see less government benefit? I just don't see a world in the next 5 to 10 years where coverage subsidies, for example, are going to be meaningfully reduced. Although maybe, for example, in a Republican world, you wouldn't get a permanent extension of the extra ACA subsidies that you've gotten for the last 5 years. That, to me, those are like the delineations. There's not a world where suddenly we don't have, it's just not going to happen politically. So
from your lips to God's ears, but I'm just taking Trump at his word. he wants to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. It was only John McCain that kept him the first time from doing it. So
Well, I haven't heard him. I haven't heard much talk
So-
about
so-
repealing the ACA this time around. So anyway, go ahead.
So I think, yeah,
Peter, go
you'd
ahead.
rather get caught up in the tactical, I do think that what this discussion is, it sort of reads and it goes into my main point, which is no matter who wins, there's going to be a need for biotech innovators and investors to continue to educate and advocate so that no matter who's in charge, no matter what staff they have, that they actually have a better understanding of how the ecosystem works. And it's whether it's at the FTC understanding the importance of small innovators being that seed to larger manufacturer innovators so that they can actually complement and do the things that small innovators can't do, like effectively market and manufacture innovations at a low cost, whether it's also, to stay in front of policymakers on the Democratic side to say, how do you fix the IRA so that you continue to create incentives for small molecule R&D? Those are the types of people willing to raise their hand and advocate and educate on behalf of that biotech ecosystem.
Yeah, Peter, if I could add to that as well. I mean, I think when we think about the biotech ecosystem broadly, interest rates in the short term are going to impact, we believe, I mean, they're going to impact investments on the private side and the public side. Generalists coming back into the public side are going to impact, obviously, exits via IPO on the private side, which is very good for the biotech ecosystem. And when we think about additional forms of financing, we look at something like ARPA-H, that's something that I think is starting to be viewed as there's a lot of money. They're looking to put an enormous amount of money to work. So I think that's a good thing from a financing perspective. The flip side of that, we've been talking about what's going to happen to small molecules, right? How are cost reductions going to impact what investors invest in and therefore what pharma actually buys? So I think those are the topics. If I were sitting here as a early stage biotech CEO, how are those issues going to impact me in the short term and the medium term as we think about an election?
Yeah, maybe. So I think Yvonne is making a reference to the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe let's get into that. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about the impact it's already having on the industry. And then if we can talk a little bit about, for our audience, a little bit about the disparity between small and large molecules, maybe Peter. But Yvonne, do you have any, so you were starting to get into it, but do you have any additional thoughts about the impact of that already on our industry or what it?
I do, but Peter, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, what we've heard when we've talked to investors and small innovators consistently since passage of the IRA is that, they're truly making sort of new small molecule R&D pretty much uninvestable for diseases of the aging. You're seeing a lot of investors asking innovators, that's a great idea. Can you make it a large molecule versus a small molecule? You've obviously seen large innovators say they're going to shift their revenues from 94% small molecule on to 30% larger. That's, I think, a lot due to the IRA. And the last piece I would just sort of mention, from a societal perspective, small molecules actually are great because they don't require a physician to administer most often. They are easily
Peter, I know you're probably saying a bunch of really smart stuff, but we can't really hear you.
Peter?
It's not simply about picking winners and losers. It's about
Yeah, and to pick up what I think Peter is saying, I take the perspective that, of course, there are going to be ramifications to what we're thinking about as it relates to regulation of small molecules. But I think to Peter's point, at the end of the day, there's no question that from a patient perspective, we still need small molecules, right? They're, in terms of cost of manufacturing and then ease of use, I don't see them going away. Will it change a little bit? Probably. If we look at investments anecdotally last year, right when we knew what was happening with that, or we knew, right? We kind of thought we knew. the changes weren't that drastic. I think now when we see pharma kind of redistributing what they want to do and where they want to focus, I think it's going to come into play more. But if the common denominator is the patient, which I know that's not what this topic is about, we still need small molecules. So that may be a contrarian view, but I'm going to throw that out there.
I would say there are a couple of areas where I expect a lot of activity in terms of just like adjustments to the IRA. The IRA is not going anywhere, no matter who wins. But I do think the path of the adjustments might look a little different. There's a couple of areas. One is on this question of like, how is CMS deciding what value really is, and how much do we take into account patient preferences, and so sort of some of the things beyond just like how long does this drug let you live. And I think the CMS has a sincere interest, I think, in understanding how to do that, and getting some more instructions from somebody on how to do that, somebody in Congress, I'm saying. And so I think that's going to be a very active area, certainly one where we do a lot of work right now with like early stage, even phase 1, but phase 2 pipeline companies want to understand, like, there's 20 different ways that the world might look at value, like which way helps, like, how do I tailor myself to what I think is going to happen? That's one. On the commercial side, I think a really underappreciated aspect that's just now beginning to play out is that the knock-on effects, not just for the drug that's negotiated, but for the other drugs in that category, are really, really significant, right? So I'm launching my drug tomorrow. It's got 10 years left, but one of my competitors is about to get negotiated under the IRA, and is going to be guaranteed certain kind of formulary placement, certain kind of coverage, and some disadvantages maybe on price and some advantages in other ways. What does that mean for my strategy and the net price I'm really going to be able to realize and patient access to my drug? I think there are some very surprising things from a patient perspective there that are going to just need to be adjusted. So I think that's an issue. The other issue is around launch price and thinking about the overall path of launch sequencing of different indications. Clearly, there have been, and I've done some work on this, very tough incentives on, for example, early launches of a rare disease indication, which you sort of, you'd be crazy to do if you have a bigger indication coming 2 or 3 years down the road. Like, you just got to wait. And so that's not great for patients. And I think that's also, these are all things that I think just, they weren't thinking about these things when they passed the IRA. And now there's an opportunity for everybody to kind of explain it, but the priorities of which of those things, in addition to the small versus large molecule piece, Congress is going to have to look at all of this stuff. And I think certainly in light of my limited understanding of Chevron, which I know you're much more of an expert, like, they're going to need instructions. And so that's going to be a major legislative focus, I think, no matter who wins.
Yeah, I think so all the things that you all have said, I hear in my client base as well. So Peter, like what you were saying about investors maybe being unreasonably focused right now on large molecules, I think that's a downward effect of the IRA. And to Yvonne's point, I think that will even out because we need small molecules. They're easier to develop, they're easier to administer, they're cheaper. But right now we're kind of seeing a pendulum swing, at least I am in my client base. And then with respect to the rare disease point too, Neil, I mean, a lot of companies sort of, as their development planning, they start with orphan indications as a way to get approval quicker, get onto the market quicker, and then move into larger patient populations, more mainstream diseases. And we're seeing that impact investor behavior, I think, as well. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on those. So there's a couple of pieces of legislation that have started. So I think it's called the EPIC Act, which is about evening out this 9-year versus 13-year price issue. And then there's the Orphan Cures Act to sort of address the second thing I was talking about. But like, where do you all see those going? And is this election going to matter on that? Like, or Neil, were you kind of saying that Congress has to address it and they will, regardless of who wins?
Well, I mean, I think they will attempt to address some of this stuff. But you know, if you're like, there's a pretty good chance you have Senate, you know, the Democrats controlling one house, Republicans controlling the other. It's going to be tough for them to agree on some of these things, other than minor tweaks. So, for example, dealing with the competitive after effects of like the IRA's existence, that doesn't, I think that'd be much tougher to do than, let's say, the rare disease piece, which I do think most people have started to realize, oh yeah, that seems like a problem. And so whether it's expanding the number of indications you can get for rare disease, or whether it's not starting the clock ticking until you launch a non-rare indication, I mean, there's different ways you could solve that problem. But it clearly is a problem from an incentive standpoint. So yeah, I think there'll be action regardless. But I think without, you know, in a divided Congress, and whoever's president in a divided Congress, you know, your lane is getting more narrow in terms of stuff you can really pass through.
Greg, go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. So put yourself in the position of the new administration, whichever one it is, and a new Congress. Personally, I think Congress, in the worst case scenario, will be divided. I think as a Democrat, in my best case scenario, the House will definitely go Democrat, and the Senate will be very, very narrowly Democrat. In that scenario, the critical thing to deal with any of these issues is that a Democratic House is much more likely to produce actual legislation, and the Senate is one place where you can actually negotiate legislation. The House is a majoritarian body. There's not a lot of negotiation there once they land on a position. The Senate, contrary, is not a majoritarian organization. So these issues can be negotiated out, but if they don't happen at the very beginning with the reconciliation bill, which is a grab all majority vote, financial underpinning, but you can put other things on it, some things, not everything. If it doesn't happen then, it won't happen for a couple of years, because no president wants to start their big ambitious agenda by undoing something that was done wrong in the previous administration. So what's the trade-off? If the Congress said, okay, bring your IRA corrections, bring your small molecule equivalent corrections, what are you going to give up for it? And I know what you're going to give up for. You're going to have to support a tax on the ultra wealthy. There's not going to be a reconciliation bill without a tax on the wealthy. And to Neil's point earlier, yes, entitlements are, both parties are addicted to entitlements, but Trump's $1 trillion tax cut for the wealthy would have gone a long way to address entitlement problems. But instead, we just took that money and lit it on fire in the Hamptons.
Peter, I know you have I know you've been thinking about how tax policy or tax negotiations will affect, could be a place where some change could be made. Do you want to add anything to what Greg said?
There are usually two major vehicles every, you know, there's always an end year post-election omnibus where they do like grab all of issues, and you know, maybe at the end of this Congress we'll see post-election at least some PBM reform, some prior authorization reform. But when it comes to these issues, I think folks are correct that there's going to be no matter who's in charge, they're going to have to extend the tax cuts next year through this reconciliation process, which is how they did IRA, and that creates an opportunity to make some of these changes and fight for those changes. And regardless of the larger politics, I think there's going to be avenues if innovators and investors do a good job of focusing their champions on some of these core issues, that there'll be running room to at least get your change. And there's ways to pay for our changes that don't affect the broader ecosystem as well. So I'm a little optimistic, regardless of who's in charge, there's going to be an opportunity for the industry to make meaningful changes that benefit patients and society.
Yvonne, I see you shaking your head. Does that line up with what you're sort of hearing too?
It does. And I think, you know, to your earlier point, Karen, the pendulum is swung in one direction. I think if we come back to the patient, you know, ultimately I have hope that we do what's right in that category, right? What's right for the patient, but we'll see where politics end up.
And Karen, one other area that we haven't touched on yet, and we have plenty of time, but there are a couple of, to me, bipartisan interest areas that are not directly biopharma, but have really major biopharma implications. The two areas I think are related. One is to do with the non-for-profit hospitals, which I think have kind of caught the attention of everybody from Bernie Sanders to the Republicans. And then the other is the 340B program, which is a giant mess, and is related to the first one. And just to say, I do think that from an FTC standpoint or justice standpoint on the administrative side, you could see more active interest in antitrust and some of the other actions you might be able to take against not-for-profit hospitals that routinely have operating margins north of 20% that are also eligible for the 340B program, which is, you know, we're over $100 billion worth of drug product flows through this 340B program now, which is a sort of a off the rails, I would say, originally intended to help small rural charity hospitals, 30 to 40 hospitals, now is, you know, 2,600 hospitals making, you know, a fortune, buying up every oncology practice known to society. Those incentives are really screwy, and I think are areas where, frankly, policymakers of all parties should be very interested in figuring out a way to make changes. It connects to Peter's PBM industry as well, because a lot of the profit, probably 10 billion or more, flows to the PBMs through the contract pharmacy relationships of that 340B program. And it all stems from that not-for-profit status of those hospitals, because that's what makes them eligible for the program. I think that you could see under either administration, hopefully under any configuration, real interest in that that program and in the not-for-profit status generally of those hospitals. So that to me is another area, big knock-on effects on the industry, but we'll see if any of that happens. That's my 2 cents.
Two quick things to follow on Neil's point, which is in addition to the legislative process, there is an annual regulatory cadence at CMS, whether it's through the or HRSA, that where you can make some of these incremental changes to address some of the abuses that are occurring either in the 340B marketplace or even you know, with PBMs. And because ultimately, we're not going to be successful as an industry unless we ensure that the savings that the market brings actually are passed to the consumer, whether it's through, you know, sort of cost plus pricing, making sure rebates are passed on to the consumer through out of savings flowing to the patient, not just to the health plans.
You know, one thing pharma in particular tends to focus on is the reward part of the risk reward equation. But in good times, that's easy. But in bad times, and the IRA created bad times for the industry, even though the cost of new drugs is an order of magnitude higher than it was 20 years ago. And it's becoming more and more the leading cause of bankruptcy. So how do they reduce the risk is the question we should be discussing as well. And this isn't necessarily the government's job. This is the industry's job. And a pony I ride all the time is that if you're going to keep a financial system from the 1950s and not bring yourself into the 21st century with derivative markets and other ways of hedging your risks, then you're going to remain in a cash flow business. And a cash flow business is an incredibly volatile way to go because you cannot deal with your uncertainties. So the industry, and this is a great time to do it, needs to re-examine the economics that underlie the industry as a whole, not just pharma, but between pharma and the payers, so that instead of this, we could do this and actually have collaborative developments. Tom Phillipson, the former head of the Council of Economic Advisors for Trump, has a proposal regarding FDA default swaps to hedge against failure at the FDA. So there are a lot of things the industry could be doing to de-risk on the financial side. And if it takes a little adversity to get them to pay attention to that, that'll be a good outcome.
Anything, so all these points that the panelists have made, is there even going to be attention in the government to like the points you brought up, Neil, about the various places within the pharmaceutical industry where there could be inefficiencies or outsized profits or people taking advantage of the various laws that we have? Is that something that you think is going to get more or less attention depending on how the election goes? I mean, Peter, maybe this is a question for you as well, like, and Greg.
It's a great question, Karen. I mean, you know, I don't think, certainly having been in the industry during the Trump administration, it's not like you feel like you're getting some big upgrade from a regulatory standpoint, one way or the other here. I think the industry, you know, I mean, I think it's fair to say he was pretty tough on the industry certainly from a pricing standpoint. And, you know, I think you can, clearly the Biden administration, IRA, over the long run, much more impactful in terms of the impact on the industry. You have these long-term, you know, changes to the whole shebang. But the Trump administration, from an industry perspective, felt scary because you were suddenly, you know, let's do international price comparisons where they couldn't care less about patients. And you know, there were lots of like kind of what I would categorize as nutty ideas that were really getting the, you know, that are like of a piece with like some of the worst trade ideas and some of the other things that you kind of, you know, as an economist tend to dislike. And so I don't know, like, I don't know what the right rooting interest is from that perspective and how to think about it. I think that the piece that I think is most fork in the road from a patient perspective is really on this question around what counts as value, and are we really going to think seriously about patient preferences and caregiver preferences and the long run path, or are we going to think about this year's budget? And I think Greg makes a good point that, you know, thinking about this as this year's budget is what got Medicaid into trouble with the hepatitis drugs, for example. It's like those should have been like the greatest, everybody should have been doing a dance, and instead they were just worried because it was 1 year problem. Look at what happened to the prices 3 years later. We're going to see the exact same thing on the obesity drugs, which you already started to see yesterday with the announcement from Lilly. Those prices are, you know, have nowhere to go but down as you can see more competition. And so a lot of these 1 year problems, the other thing, you know, with the Alzheimer's drugs, which was like sort of a complete crazy episode in policy that happened where they raised the Part B premiums to cover the Alzheimer's drugs that were supposed to be coming by $10 a month. And the Alzheimer's drugs didn't come, and then they never lowered the premium. It's like, well, that shouldn't happen. So I think that these kind of patient focused things look different depending on which administration, and to Greg's earlier point, who's in charge. I personally would like to see more of an emphasis on a much broader and flexible definition of what counts as value. And I mean, that's basically what we built our company to focus on. You know, I think there is a hugely important role for everybody to play, industry in articulating that value and policymakers in accepting that that value is there. And that's an area where we can all kind of get together no matter who's in charge.
Just to follow up on Neil's point about value, this is a big deal because it's not just innovators complaining, oh, the government doesn't understand us. There's actually faulty and outdated math that these HT entities have been using for many years. They omit very quantifiable values like the fact that a drug goes generic, the fact that population changes, the fact that there's a difference between the list price and the actual market price. And so these are the types of ways where, you know, No Patient Left Behind is encouraging large and small innovators to all, you know, improve their math and how they describe the value of the drug, not to set the price, but to at least have that discussion about, do we want health plans to benefit, or do we want patients and society to benefit? And how do we tell that story in a way that you know, puts us on a better, fairer footing with government agencies?
There's a question Oh, I just wanted to mention for a minute, laboratory developed tests. This is an issue that has been going on for over 20 years. I remember being in a meeting with Brooke Byers 15 or 20 years ago on this, and I actually gave them the name of their coalition, the 21st Century Medicine Coalition. And during the Obama years, Rob Califf was at the FDA, and they tried to get a bill passed on this, and it just kept blowing up. Well, now they finally have a set of rules, but that doesn't mean it hasn't blown up, because a lot of people in Congress are saying, don't start doing this until we have a chance to really investigate it, because laboratory developed tests are ubiquitous at this point. Some of them very important, some of them not as important. But you know, there's a lot of confusion. If you have a diagnostic that is a precursor to further testing as compared to a yes or no, you have a disease, that's one thing. If you have a black and white scenario, the FDA is very cautious about those because of unintended harms from false negatives, false positives. So the diagnostics industry has kind of been approaching this like this, because they were scared that they're finally going to lose this one. And I'm with them on this. I think that over-regulation of lab-developed tests would be a bad idea. But I also know that the implementation of the new rules is multi-years. So I think this is going to come up. Whoever runs the FDA next is going to revisit this, because it keeps getting revisited. But it has a huge impact when you're talking about cancer diagnostics. It's where I focus a lot of my attention these days, is early stage multi-cancer early detection, so-called MCEDs. And that is a really burgeoning field. Worst thing we could do is say, oh, you're going to spend 3 years proving to us your diagnostic is valuable. That would be a big mistake.
But Greg, I think you raise a really interesting point with that specific piece of legislation, because companies have reacted to it already in one camp or the other, right? And investors are looking at this, and in some cases they're saying they're all saying exactly what you just said. We don't know. And that murkiness is creating a little bit of paralysis in terms of investments in that space. So in terms of something that could actually help healthcare, right? Exactly what you talked about. Here's a diagnostic for cancer, and we can talk about how helpful that is across the spectrum. The investments have hit pause, not across the board, but in a way that's very real because of exactly this. Well, is it an overhang? Is it a question mark? Which way is it going to go? I know when we talked on our prep call, you talked about people, right? The people component is changing as well in terms of these decision makings, regardless of what administration is coming in, right? We've already seen some of these people who've actually come forward and said this should change, have left. So that's a really interesting, and I would say very timely topic in terms of what will happen here.
I think that uncertainty is always something that affects the investing environment, right, Yvonne? But I will say on the LDT issue in particular, I think I was drafting an S1 for a diagnostic company like 12 years ago, and we had all sorts of risks around, is the FDA going to start regulating LDT? So I think that uncertainty has been hanging around on this point in particular. But yeah, certainly if it's always a topic of conversation for diagnostic companies and investors that invest in diagnostic companies. We're to close out this value point. So I think Congress just had a committee meeting on PBMs. Does that do you all view that like that indicates a real like motivation to do something about that issue, or is it like a lot of things in Congress that it was one day and we're going to leave those people alone?
I think that the current debate about PBMs is like Saturday afternoon wrestling with tag teams, and the PBMs have gotten stuck in the other corner. They're going to get beat up by liberals and conservatives. There is no justification for PBMs, zero, absolutely zero. And they harm pharma by giving them higher sticker prices, and they harm customers by claiming the money they're getting is a rebate. When I was at Pfizer, we were talking with the PBMs about Lipitor when it went off patent. And I was supposed to sign off on something for the PBM, and I took a look at it, and I looked at the rebate, and I said, this isn't a rebate, this is a kickback. and all hell broke loose because I didn't know I wasn't supposed to say that. But that's what it is. PBMs are a kickback business. We don't need kickbacks.
All right, so maybe one more thing before we open it up for more questions, but I did already see a question in the chat about bringing production back to the U.S. So the Biosecure Act is intended, I think, to do that, and at least, but what I'm hearing from companies that are currently, a lot of clients that are currently reliant on Chinese-owned CDMOs, it's causing a lot of consternation in the industry. And I don't think it's because my clients disagree with the purpose of the Biosecure Act to bring manufacturing back to the US, but just because it's so much a part of the ecosystem right now. What do you all think? Maybe Yvonne, maybe we'll start with you with respect to what investors think about this, but then I'd like to hear broadly, and I think our audience would, about like, what do we think the likelihood of this passing is? I think Speaker Johnson said it's going to come to a vote this year, but do we really think that's going to happen? And how do we think the election impacts that?
Yeah, so I'll speak more narrowly on just companies and investors. I think if we step back and just look at the bigger picture of what is happening or has happened with CFIUS, and then specifically with manufacturing, there's been an impact there from dollars not flowing into the US, right? And that's just the reality of that situation. And whether or not that changes, I'll let others speak to that. In terms of production itself, we've absolutely seen a shift. And part of the questions that have been asked in diligence is, who's your manufacturer? Who's your backup manufacturer, right? Because when we've had one of the top manufacturers kind of, I think it's fair to say sidelined, and maybe others would use a different word, but there's a scramble right now. So I think, again, it's how do we if in fact we're going to do that, what's the infrastructure, where are the dollars coming from, and how are we going to build that, if in fact that's what we need to do? But from a political perspective, I'd love others' opinions. So
I am a fellow of the Asia Society as of a year ago. And the reason I am is that there's an effort called Cure Number 4 Cancer that involves all of the Pacific Rim countries. But and the FDA has opined about the proper way to do international trials these days, especially in places like China. The problem is, even when Biden met with President Xi of China, they didn't discuss cancer. China has the worst cancer burden in the world. As a patient advocate, I don't want global politics to interfere with the right of cancer patients in China to have the same access to cures that people have in the US. But when China is threatening Taiwan and the Philippines and the Straits and doing all kinds of aggressive things, there's a real hesitancy at the top of our government, and it would be far worse under Trump than under a Democrat, that all things China have got to go. They're the enemy, can't do anything with them. When in fact, it should be the other way around. We did the space station with Russia to contain their ability and their desire to sell rockets to Iran. And we did that to try to develop better relationships which worked before Putin. We need to use cancer and the medical research abilities of the US as a way to build a better relationship with China, not as the result of a better relationship with China. And the demonization of Chinese biotech companies writ large, without regard to individual situations, is very dangerous and I think very depressing. So I'm hoping that this will be an issue we can resolve, but China has to be a little less aggressive as well. And we can't really control that.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Greg, I agree. There are a lot of interesting and impressive companies and scientists in China that have been building out these products, and I've been there many times. We're talking about a product that people put in their mouths or inject into their bodies, and it's an act of trust every time a patient does that in the industry. And I think it's fair to say that trust in the post-COVID and in the current state of the world and sort of what is China doing, I think that they've done a lot to diminish that trust and that's being, policymakers are seeing that play out. And it's something they could recapture and repair, but it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing the policy effort that we're seeing, because there's a trust deficit right now that is in large part, in my view, self-inflicted. And so, I'd like to say that they're gonna steer the ship more like it was being sheared, let's say 10 or 12 years ago. The things were kind of going in one direction. They seem like they've gone in a different direction. And I think it just doesn't surprise me the policymakers are responding the way they are. And it's just tied up with this broader issue around trust and the deterioration of the relationship, which is sad. I agree.
Yeah.
There's also a meta point here, which is we can't preserve U.S. competitiveness by complaining about China in biotech. And while we're imposing price controls on drugs just 9 years after launch, China is a massive investment program to build up and grow their biotech ecosystem. China, and that will have varying impacts depending on the size of your company that Congress is trying to address. But the meta issue, I think, is more how do we preserve U.S. competitiveness? And part of that is fixing IRA. Part of that is ensuring that insurance remains affordable to patients, because that's really the true reimburser for innovation in this country. And how do we do it in a way that puts us on a better footing towards China by domestic action versus just complaining about how China does their things.
So to that point, and Yvonne sort of started with making a comparison to CFIUS, which I think is right, and it gets towards the last couple of things that Peter and Neil said. But somebody in the comments actually made a comparison to the CHIPS Act, right? So less about being afraid of China in particular, and more about just being able to manufacture our own stuff and control our own supply chain for something as critical as pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and I would add to that, as we look at some of the manufacturing, not issues, but topics that come up specifically in cell and gene therapy, understanding and really having access to manufacturing, not just having access, but also knowing and being able to not necessarily walk out your door, but having manufacturing pretty close, because those are some of the hurdles that are going to impact. And we're talking about small molecules versus large molecules. Biologics, absolutely, we need to think about manufacturing, and we need to think about it in a very real way.
Maybe before we go to questions, I'll just open it up for anything we haven't talked about, or broad views about the U.S. political landscape and the future of this industry related to that.
Well, I think it's hard to underestimate what damage could be done if Robert Kennedy Jr. has now been added to the Trump transition team.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine the health officials that RFK Jr., who's an anti-vaxxer, would bring into the government? So that there's not even a contest there. In terms of my original statement, it's all about the team. If you think Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. are the best people to put your team together, good luck with that. So that's a real issue.
I don't know, Greg, I'd like to have healthy food, but I'll open it up to
Well, Greg,
So
let me, I think just to add some balance, I think there are plenty of scary folks on any either administration's list of who they'd like to hire and put into key roles on any number of topics, right? So people aren't probably voting on healthcare policy this year. That's my guess. And RFK, has many interests, Greg. Not just vaccines that concern him. So who knows what portfolio, if any, you may have noticed Trump does not always totally follow through on everything he says he's going to do. So I guess we'll have to see how things play out. But I do think that this general notion of whether it's a healthcare election or not, there's going to be a lot of health policy stuff that happens. And I do think it's a funny issue this year because it's a little hard to divine, what is going to be different at CMS under these. Yeah, there's just it's kind of a mush right now. There's a lot of things where there's bipartisan interest. There's a lot, people seem to understand a lot of what Peter's saying about the difference between small molecule, large molecule, why, you know, there's a lot of weird stuff that could sort of be solved no matter who's in charge. You'd like to believe that's where they're going to go. We'll see.
Well, I had a lot of differences with Trump in one specific area, CMS. Seema Varma, I had a lot of differences of opinion with, but she was a professional and she knew what she was doing. And
Yes.
she was also Mike Pence's person. So those people are gone. No Mike Pence people coming back. And I think if you have Trump and RFK Jr. on one side of the ledger, there's absolutely no point in talking about balance on the other side of the ledger. The worst Democrat you could imagine could not balance RFK Jr. I'm sorry.
That is that is, I will just say that I am imagining them now, and it's definitely just as horrifying. So
okay,
yeah.
We'll talk about that at a bar because I have to be very drunk.
Yvonne or Peter, any overall thoughts on this topic?
On this, not specifically, but I think investments are going to continue, right? There are clearly issues where the government or one or the other administration are going to impact the topics we're talking about, but innovation is going to continue, investments will continue, and I think there are going to be some question marks that need to be resolved here. And they're not going to be resolved in November, and I don't think they're going to be resolved in January, and things will continue. But I do think clarity is a very good thing when it comes to investing in innovation. And I think that's what, you know, that would be good.
I think that's a great point, Yvonne, that right now there's just a lot of noise for investors to try to process and sort through, and any clarity we can get out of the next configuration will help the investing environment by just reducing that unexpected the volatility around policies got to come down.
And just to follow that point, because I agree, follows is that, you know, it also means the importance of investors and innovators being willing to raise their hand and share their view to try and achieve that clarity. You know, there's no longer, you know, post IRA with CMS, you now have the ability to set the price of drugs, and it will expand. Some will try to make it expand and make it harsher. We need to make sure that innovators and investors are active in educating policymakers about the impact on negative consequences of their actions, but also the benefits of finding that clarity. So there's no longer time for it to be a bystander. You have to raise your hand, and encourage you to work with groups like ours, like No Patient Left Behind, to help you.
Peter, we didn't even talk about that, but that's a great way to lead us into questions. Thank you for that.
It is. So,
Sarah,
go ahead.
did you want to run with asking some of these questions, or
Yeah, what I'd like to do, I saw that both Peter and Greg were typing answers to some of the questions, and I'd like you to pick out the ones that you think that we should share with everybody who's on the salon, and, you know, ask the question and provide the answer. Can you do that, Greg?
Yeah.
And then we'll go to Peter.
So let's see here.
I think the first one you answered is about march-in rights, Greg.
Yes, we talked about ETs, but I got a question about march-in rights at the NIH and something Kamala said in 2019. In the 40 years almost since the Bayh-Dole Act, the NIH has marched in maybe once or twice. Companies have tried to, like with Taxol, which is a very famous case, Bristol tried to extend their patent and their license from the NIH in a way that Ted Kennedy would never have let them do. And as a result, you know, they came up with the different formulation for synthetic Taxol. But the history of march-in rights is like one in 40 years. This is not the issue. The issue is the misunderstanding in society that the government, starting after World War II, took over funding medical research and other academic research, which previously had been the field of corporations. the NIH is supposed to take your tax dollars and turn it into life-saving medicines by getting the system started. It was never intended to develop drugs. Very few people there even know how to develop a drug. So the idea that NIH would just march in as a cost control agency, it's not going to happen. They don't know how to do that. They don't want to do that. BIDO will probably get redone here very soon. It is kind of ancient at this point. So march-in rights aren't the answer. Now, if somebody sat on a cure for cancer for a year, maybe, but I don't see that happening either. So march-in rights, I wouldn't lose sleep over.
Okay, is that the only question you answered that
That's the only one I wrote a direct answer to, yeah.
Okay, okay.
I was looking at some of the others. The LDT I just brought up in the conversation.
Right. Yeah, Peter?
A few things. One, there was a question around PBM reform and the like term. And the challenge, even though there's this powerful coalition of sort of rural conservative pharmacists, community pharmacists, and urban consumer advocates, when you actually try and pass PBM reform, the Congressional Budget Office gives it a big slur as costing money. They probably haven't caught up with the fact that plans are not pocketing it themselves.
Yeah, Peter, you keep freezing. So one of the questions, somebody said, get Peter's video or internet connection fixed. So I'm sorry, but this question about PBMs and how PBMs and that whole system, how they frankly interfere with pricing of therapeutics, how it's going to be resolved. We've had 2 or 3 questions, asking that question. How will it happen? Will PBMs be regulated? Will they be taken apart? Will they be required to dismantle themselves? What do you think the answer will be?
That's a great question, Sarah. And I think that the PBMs have become a catch-all phrase for the sort of interference and involvement between, they're trying to rationalize some role for themselves in the system. I think there are a number of startup PBMs that are much more transparent and that, are sort of doing the things that the broader industry says. But it's really, the PBMs were smart 5 or 6 years ago to sort of embed themselves within much larger organizations that are kind of hard to break up.
Right.
So, I think they have become kind of grown tendrils and permeated through the industry. So for example, I mentioned the 340B program earlier. The big, certainly the PBMs, 340B income goes in generally in PBM profit. This is strange, right? So they do that even though all that's happening is the drugstore is selling a 340B drug on behalf of a covered entity, but somehow that flows through the PBM numbers. So it's very opaque. It's all very unclear what's happening within the PBM. I think it's a great reason for them to investigate as they're doing and look into the PBMs. But I'm not that optimistic that the net result is going to be a huge change to the system, partly because the entire healthcare system is being funded on the backs of those rebates at this point.
Right.
And so they've sort of insinuated themselves in such a way that, to the operation to take out the tumor is going to kill the patient is what they'll say. And so we'll have to see. I am very positive that there will be intense focus and regulation to continue on PBMs, but I'm very pessimistic that they would somehow be blown up and go away. I don't see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the articles, the investigative reporting that has appeared over the last maybe month or so, that talks about the roll-ups of the insurance companies, the PBMs, the people that do, recommend what pricing should happen, how you can get the lowest price out of it. So I think, uncovering it, if you will, will lead to some discussion. I hope. Greg, you're close on that too. What do you think?
Well, first, there are enough problems to go around, and in healthcare inflation. I'm actually dealing with all of this on the other side. So there's not much I can do to make the insurance companies behave, and there's not much I can do to make the PBMs behave. But what I can do is offer individuals and participants in the market new financial hedging tools that allow them to deal with uncertainty and allow them to deal with healthcare inflation, which is historically higher than typical consumer inflation. So we know where prices are going up. We know who the companies are who are getting that money. I'm focused on creating portfolios for health savings accounts and self-insured companies and pension funds and treasury funds for different retirement groups to be able to invest in the healthcare economy in a way that beats inflation. So that even when the industry is acting badly and prices are going up far more than they should, you at least can benefit on the side of the people who are getting the money to pay for your health insurance bills, and society as well. Big companies that face huge impacts, like the automobile industry, from increased health costs, they can't hedge that just by raising the price of a car. That's not how that works. So they need financial tools, which they have not had. Healthcare, even though it's the largest sector of the economy, is the least financially developed sector of the economy. So if we can fix that, we can go a long way to fixing healthcare costs.
Okay, Peter, Peter, come back on.
Give it a try.
We'll give you grace.
I'm on the road, so I apologize to everybody on the call. But I do want to emphasize that employers can play a big role in driving PBM reform that does not require legislation or regulation. And that the purchasing decisions about requiring that their benefits consultant / plan / PBM actually offer greater transparency, accountability, and actually result in savings for their employees. That's something that folks can do on their own and impact a significant part of the American health insurance system without the government doing anything. So definitely ask your own employer or ask your HR department, what are we doing with our health insurance contracting to ensure our PBMs ripping us off? Because I agree that PBMs are needed. They help make the private market work. They help make Medicare Part Advantage and Part D work. But at the same time, vertical integration, how the sort of ways to circumvent the MLR, how do you drive revenues and profit from regulated revenues to unregulated profit and revenues. That's all that's been caught up in this system, and there needs to be changes, starting with employers asking better of their own PBMs.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We have one question on a different topic that just came in, and the question is, what will it take for venture capital and private equity companies to get off the sidelines and to come back in? Who wants to tackle that one?
I mean, I don't know if the questioner for this, I'll just real quick, I don't know if the person who asked this question is in the US or not, but biotech and tech are the two industries in the US where venture capital does invest. So the question also asks, like, what industry is competing? So, and private equity does not invest in biotech generally. Biotech is not revenue producing. It doesn't meet the private equity model. But yeah, Yvonne, go ahead.
So, I mean, just context, we all know 2023 was, say it was tough is putting it mildly. We've seen the market come back a little bit. We're not quite there yet. The IPO window is starting to open. I think it's fair to say that, but it's not where it was even in Q1 of this year. But interest rates, I know we touched upon that at the beginning of this conversation. Interest rates will, I do believe, impact where we're going with investments. And I think we're starting, I want to be optimistic here. I think we're starting to see a positive change, but remains to be seen, right? We need the companies who are going to go public, go out and do well, right? And continue to have success in the IPO market. We're seeing M&A, not across the board, but definitely in certain indications. I'd like to think that's going to continue, but it's still tough out there.
I guess, Sarah, I would answer the question I do agree that there's some activity. I mean, I think VCs are still doing, starting to do stuff. When we started our company to help try to figure out, like, what is this potential innovation worth? my theory was it was all going to be big pharma pipeline stuff. And in fact, what we've seen is even VCs and certainly early stage investors have taken an enormous interest in trying to understand, like, if I'm going to invest in this drug or this therapeutic area more broadly for like a VC, what is the value of the unmet need? Not just what's the epidemiological piece of the unmet need, but how do I figure out the market size of that thing based on what society really will pay for like a target product profile, the kind of things that you do when you're a VC. So I think if we can help them understand that, which is going to come partly from that reduction in policy noise, like what world am I entering, but also by giving them tools that can help them understand, like, okay, so if you cure this kind of cancer with this amount of efficacy, this is probably what that's going to be worth. And that's just not how VCs have traditionally thought. They just think in terms of the pure science generally. So giving them more of a flavor for that, I think, can help get them, you know, in off of the sidelines a little faster.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. We have one last question that just came in, and it's going back to day one of the new administration concept. The ACA repeal effort in 2017 was a ready, shoot, aim effort. I can't read the whole thing. Is repeal without a detailed replace and limited discussion or thought leadership. What is your assumption on the biggest day one aim and shove it down somebody's throat maneuver from the new administration, whichever one it is?
Ooh, that's a good question.
That's a complicated.
Yeah,
I would just, my super quick answer, and let everybody else have better ideas than me, is, you know, I do think that the activity around the supply chain in China would be a very ripe area for that kind of thing out of, let's say, a Trump administration coming in and like really wanting to kind of stick it to China in some way. So I would, that would be my vote for that side. On the Democratic side, I think maybe it's like going after it depends on whether they have the majority in Congress. If they had a majority in Congress and they really want to try to do something, I think it would be like make permanent and bigger the enhanced ACA subsidies. Kind of that would be the direction I imagine they would go, because that's where they've wanted to go. Okay. So that would be what I would say.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes left. Peter, you wanted to jump in?
In this instance, I actually kind of think it's, you know, sometimes it's a good reminder that we're the only ones who are thinking about us all the time, and that it's not always about us. And I would sort of view Democratic administration.
We always lose him right when he's getting ready to
Right
say
when he
something
gets to the meat of it.
I know, just when he's getting to the hot spot.
I don't think either party will have a day one agenda for healthcare. The Democrats will introduce a voting rights bill and a bill to codify Roe v. Wade. The only thing they would do, they can't do either of those in reconciliation, but they will put in the tax the rich into reconciliation. So if Trump wins, he's going to be too busy calling out the army to deport illegal immigrants to deal with healthcare.
Okay, I think that wraps it up. We have 1 minute, Karen.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for letting me be involved. Neil, Greg, Peter, Yvonne, thank you all for your insights. I think the audience has really benefited from your experience and your expertise. And it would have been even better if Peter's Wi-Fi would have been working. Anyway, thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Sarah.
And I do want to thank everybody as well. Karen, thank you so much for leading the discussion. Neil, Yvonne, Greg, and the disappearing Peter Rubin. Peter, we're thanking you. So thank you very much for joining us. And that's all the time that we'll have today. This will be posted on our website, on our YouTube channel later today, so everybody can go back in and see it. Don't forget, BioFuture is coming up in New York City, October 28, 29, and 30. We hope everybody can join us there. So bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Looking forward to it.
Bye-bye.